Just starting the live stream now.
Okay. Ben, why do I stop my Word document disappearing from that side?
From the levellers to those who trespassed at Kinder Scout, ordinary people are the ones who change history.
Welcome to you all, wherever you are joining us. Before I introduce our amazing panel of speakers, like we should all be used to by now, we have to just go through some tech reminders. We do have interpretation for this event. It is in Spanish and BSL, British Sign Language. If you're new to Zoom, most people are old hands. There's a global icon at the right hand side, usually at the bottom of your screen. You can press that. One of our speakers will be speaking in Spanish, so we will be using that. We will endeavour to try and speak slowly. This session is being live streamed. It's being broadcast on YouTube, on Facebook, and of course on Zoom as well. And I am absolutely grateful and extremely grateful to all of our panelists and to all of you who've joined us today. We all recognise that this is a moment where the future of humanity hangs in the balance. And what is the key is, of course, the discussions that we have together. When War on Want helped found the COP26 coalition, we did so as part of our long-standing commitment to climate justice, centering the realities of the global south, and particularly our frontline communities and movements, amplifying their demands and our collective visions. And over the weekend, many of you probably participated in the Global Day of Action. We put 150,000 people on the streets here in Glasgow, thousands more across the UK, millions around the world in over 800 actions and mobilisations as part of the Global Day of Action, moving the dial from injustice to justice and calling for that the era of injustice is over. But it's not just mobilising, it's organising and transforming. And this panel, which is part of the People Summit that we've helped organise across hundreds of sessions, is to deepen our perspectives, enrich and deepen our conversation on some of the critically important discussions we need to have. Our understandings around concepts of climate justice, decolonisation, feminist organising, racial justice. Just slow down, I'm sorry. How we amplify our impacts within and across all the spaces in which we operate, and how do we anchor the concept of system change to help us build our collective power for change. And this is a session really in a moment where we try and weave some of those strands together, recognising, of course, the scales of the crisis that we face. My colleague is going to share a screen with you. Just for a second. So first of all, just for those who don't know War on Want, it's a pretty unique organisation in that its mission, vision and values from its foundation 70 years ago to this day has been very, very different to other more mainstream organisations based in the global north. Its focus has always been on the root causes and drivers of poverty, its goal at inequality and injustice, its goal of uprooting the systems that are at the heart of this crisis. And of course, today's climate injustices has led it to often being called the global South organization in the North, willing to speak truth to power, to name the systems of injustice such as colonialism, imperialism, and neoliberalism, and a practice of working alongside its networks of partners, social movements, workers' organizations, and frontline communities across the world, three of whom we're joined with by today, and of course, working here in the UK as well, providing resources, amplifying demands, and working collectively together to campaign. And for 70 years, we've been rooted in this vibrant ecology of global social movements with this very intersectional analysis and intersectional demands in all of our work, and supporting and resourcing movements against extractivism, food sovereignty, right to housing, supporting workers' organizations in critical supply chains, such as the garment sector, as well as the informal economy across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And we also campaign here in the UK, particularly with low-paid workers and the targeting of neoliberal policies of our own governments and multinationals, including unfair trade policies, privatization, corporate power, and militarism, was always understanding that we needed to build the bonds of solidarity and transformational power of collective organizing if we were ever to realize our vision of a safe and just world. And I was reminded earlier this morning of just that 70 years ago, actually, War on Want published an amazingly groundbreaking plan for world development in support of the anti-colonial struggles of the time, which called for a universal welfare system, for food to be guaranteed as a right, for redirecting of military spending, and for rich countries to commit to 5% of their GDP to end the structural inequities between the North and the global South. And that's a stark contrast between the 0.002% of that is being currently offered and in the climate negotiations, of course, unmet. Even that has been unmet promises.
Asad, could you just slow down a bit for me, please?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I will. I'm sorry. Apologies. I'm Northern, we have a habit of speeding up as we talk. But we all recognize now that the importance of decolonizing both the economic and political stranglehold of the North and the South, and championing the right of the South to chart its own future with the policy pathways and tools for development pathways that realize the rights of their citizens to live with dignity. And it's because of our body of work and that of all of our amazing partners and movements that we've been inspired to work on this global Green New Deal project, which has been a framework to ensure when we talk about a just transition, it's really a justice transition from below and above. How we could move the dial from crisis to justice, how do we shift public consciousness, policy discourse, but also how we build our collective power that's necessary for this change. And of course, we've all recognized over the last 2 years that this pandemic has created huge new challenges for all of us. COVID vaccine apartheid, the growing global recession, including for many of our plans of our movements to be able to be together, South, 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 North. And this is why this event, we've thought it was really critical to be online and not just a physical event here at the People's Summit, because we recognize many of our movements are not being able to physically be here in Glasgow. So this session will take you through a journey that we've also taken ourselves collectively, some of the foundational work we've been doing, the interventions, the ideas and plans, and of course, ultimately an opportunity for all of us collectively to work together. As I said, this is an amazing panel of speakers, and I'm deeply grateful for everybody for making their time available. We have movement leaders, we have thinkers and academics, political activists, and political leaders. We're joined today by Dr. Jason Hickel, who's an economic anthropologist. He's author of two of the most seminal books I think all activists should have on their bookshelf, and not just on their bookshelf, but we should be reading and informing themselves. Less is more and the Great Divide. He's a professor at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University in Barcelona. And Jason's work has really challenged this dominant vision of growth and development, and to think about an alternative, a radical alternative, to move us away from the politics of extractivism. We're also joined by Professor Jayati Ghosh, another great comrade and of the struggle. She's a professor of economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in India, and her specialization has been on globalization, international finance, developing countries and gender issues. She's been a very leading and probably one of the most important voices in the discussion around how to not just build, but how do you finance a global Green New Deal, providing really critical research to a variety of movements and intergovernmental organizations, including the ILO and UNCTAD. From our movements, we have Lucio Cuenca, who's the director of the Observatory for Environmental Conflicts in Latin America, OLCA, and he's based in Chile. And of course, Chile has inspired many of us as they've overthrown and overturned the cradle of neoliberalism to imagine a very different future. Lucio also sits on the board of the Observatory for Mining Conflict in Latin America. And he's been part of the environmental justice movement in Chile and in the region for decades, and also organizes with the movements for water and territories. Kalpona Akter is the executive director of the Bangladesh Center for Worker Solidarity, which is one of Bangladesh's most prominent labor rights advocacy organizations. She's also president of the Bangladesh Garment and Industrial Workers Federation, which is a national trade union center. And Kalpona is internationally recognized as a labor rights activist, as a leading voice in the trade union movement, and has won incredible awards for all of her work, and inspires us, continue to inspire us about both the importance of workers' rights as part of this discussion around justice transition. Last but not least, as my good friend Zikode, who is the founding president of Abahlali baseMjondolo, which a movement in South Africa. It is one of the most powerful and inspiring social movements, not just in South Africa, but also globally, mobilizing marginalized and working class communities. It's 100,000 strong. They've won countless victories to secure the right to a dignified life, and countless awards as well. And so it was just recently honored with the Per Anger Human Rights Prize. We're also going to be joined shortly by Ilhan Omar, who's the US represents Minnesota's 5th congressional district in the US. Ilhan, I'm sure many of you know, has been one of the supporters of the Green New Deal in the United States, and she she helped first introduce it along with Representative Ocasio-Cortez in the United States. And Ilhan is also a co-founder of the Global Parliamentary Alliance for a Green New Deal, which has brought together parliamentarians from every single continent to work together to realize this collective vision of the transformation and the transition that is needed. So before I just ask our panelists to begin, I just want to maybe give a bit of a context to this moment. So we all know we are faced with what we call a systemic crisis, right? We face multiple crises. We know we have a crisis of COVID and a vaccine apartheid, which we know we have a crisis of economic recession, hundreds of millions of jobs already lost, half the world locked into poverty, billions without housing and education, access to universal services, 2.7 billion people this very day thinking, not having food on their table. We know this is a moment of multiple crises, and there's a crisis of overconsumption and resource use, overwhelmingly by the global north. We know we have a broken or a rigged economy, which has made the richest continue to be wealthy. Over the last year alone, the world's billionaires increased their wealth by $5.5 trillion, whilst the poorest in the world have seen lost wages of trillions. But we also know that this is part and parcel of a longer system of oppression that have been hardwired and baked into our economic and political systems, the systems of colonialism and slavery through to neoliberalism and, of course, the climate crisis. And all of these, of course, compound. So whilst we all know that the climate crisis is a great injustice in itself, in that those least responsible are being most impacted. The climate crisis, of course, amplifies all of those other inequities and injustices. So solving this systemic crisis requires systemic solutions. So through our work with our movements over many years and countless conversations, discussions, we began to elaborate what the pillars of a global Green New Deal would look like. That we recognize that the importance of keeping temperatures well below 1.5 through a fair share of effort, which should mean rich countries making sure we decarbonize at real zero by 2030, recognizing whilst no temperature is safe and is deadly for many, that to prevent runaway and catastrophic climate change, that was an important guardrail. We asked second pillar of the global Green New Deal, and there's the tests to determine whether any policy solutions match the requirements of our movement was, of course, does it tackle global inequality and poverty? And thirdly, does it put people's well-being at the center of people's well-being, planet and people at the center of our policy making? And does it allow us to thrive within planetary boundaries? And of course, fourth, and just as important and often forgotten, does it uproot these historical injustices and systems of oppression that we see playing out all around us? The notion of the sacrifice and of sacrificing of people, not just as territories, but of people, of the poor, of Black, Brown, Indigenous, of women, that has been hardwired into our systems. And that really led us to, and it's an important ecology, and we're part of an important ecology, because there are many parts of our movement that have been discussing this, some for decades. What is the vision? We know what we want to resist, but what is the vision we want to put in our place? And we've been weaving together and working in many of those spaces. And I just want to recognize that there is an incredible tapestry of people who might use very, very different words and terms and different realities based on their own national or regional context. But we're coming together with a very, very similar vision of the world. And we also know often that our language is being co-opted, that now we see our own political leaders talk about build back. It's often that build back is often build back the same, but we know that they talk now about just transition. We know that there are discussions taking place in multilateral spaces, at regional spaces, at national spaces. And so this is a very critical moment if we want to shape those conversations. So we, distilling and bringing and this rich conversation, worked out what our pillars of our global Green New Deal. And there are many injustices that we need to overcome. We know that. But some of the most critical ones that sense an overlap between all of these crises is, of course, the importance of a universal basic services, the importance of a just energy transition, about global debt cancellation, about protecting our commons and restoring our ecosystems, about how we weave an economy of care and well-being and ensure we have sustainable shelter for all, but also the importance of reparations to remedy the injustices done by racialized capitalism. And that requires food sovereignty and water justice and land rights. But we can't transition without also securing labor rights and dignified jobs for all. And of course, we recognize that the world we live in is built on carceral militarism, and we need to dismantle that if we want to build the societies of peace and justice. So all of these futures are sitting there. And we know that there are many different things we need to unpack and unweave, but there are some common threads through the tapestry of injustice that if we begin to pluck and undo, they transform all of our movements and all our lives. And we began to develop this framework about, we needed real zero targets by the richest by 2030, about dismantling the fossil fuel sector, but also ensuring that we have at least 1.5 trillion a year for the just transition. We need to see that energy and food are public goods shared equitably within planetary limits, that tackling inequality means global living wages and not just universal public services, but also social protection and workers' rights in the very moment where much of those are being rolled back, that fixing the global economy means tax and trade, but it also means climate waivers and tackling the insidious locking in of unjust systems like the investor state dispute settlements. We need to have wealth and corporation tax, and of course, the cancellation of public and private debt. And we need to repair and go from reparations to repair. So there is an Overton window. We need to shift it. We have already begun to shift it. We know that this conversation would not have been taking place even a couple of years ago, but it is now. Now we have to shift the dial even further. So we know system change, not climate change, has been the slogan of our movement. Now we need to begin to populate that. And this is what this session begins to do. And I want to just leave that slide before I ask our first speaker to speak, because that's not somebody who's on our side, but always fitting to realize that it's not change that is coming, is not always controlled by us. And that the other side, that those who seek to profit from disaster also see crisis as producing real change, and that we are in a battle of ideas and policies, and what's lying around becomes the politically impossible, becomes the politically inevitable. And that's true not just of progressive ideas, but also of reactionary ideas at the same time. So, Sabu, I'm going to turn to you first. The right to decent housing is fundamentally also the right for land, energy and water, and for basic services. These we've identified as key things that are needed for a dignified life. And that struggle is really crucial to the justice transition. Could you speak to how you and the way that Abahlali advances this, your fight, within solidarity with poor people movements across the world? I think you need to unmute yourself, Sabu.
Thank you so much, Comrade Asad, and thank you for the opportunity. And I want to greet my fellow panelists and everyone that is participating in this important discussion. My name again is Zikode. I am the leader of the Shack Dwellers movement in South Africa, Abahlali baseMjondolo. Abahlali's life has been very disastrous. We are living a difficult life every day. The living conditions under which our communities are subjected to are life-threatening, as the United Nations has confirmed that people who are living in slums. So as we live in these shanty towns, the conditions under which we live are really threatening. So I hope I can do justice to many people around the world who are actually living a very difficult life without access to basic services such as water and sanitation. They have hardly any access to road, hardly any access to refuse collections, and they have no electricity in these shanty towns. So I hope I can do justice for those communities. However, we want to thank the fact that our voice is beginning to be heard, slowly but surely. Yeah, the starting point, Asad, when discussing this question, I think it's important to say that there must be access to land and decent housing, for everyone. I think that would be a starting point. And it's important to say that the starting point of this discussion must be that access to land and housing have been denied to the majority of the working class and the impoverished people in South Africa and around the world. So discussing land and housing without discussing justice will be unjust. To take justice seriously, we must take seriously that women have the same right to land and housing as men, and that impoverished people must not be marginalized in this process. Discussing land and decent housing without discussing impoverishment will also be unjust. Land and decent housing are a rural and an urban question. It is also a question of full sovereignty and decent housing for all. It is a question of dignity. It will ultimately become a question of democracy, of revolutionary democracy. Now, Program Director, the land comes before a decent housing because every house or a block of flat must be on land. Land also comes before housing. The housing question is about the right to the city, as well as the quality of buildings. Houses that are far outside the cities exclude people from opportunities for livelihoods, education, on the other benefits of life in a city, like health, healthcare, sports facilities, libraries, and entertainment for young people and cultural life. Also, when people have land, they can build and improve their own houses over time. Now, it is important that the social value of land comes before its commercial value. I must repeat this. For us, it is very important that the social value of land comes before its commercial value. In other words, we prioritize humanity and human needs ahead of profit, as we see that our world is actually struggling from people who are putting profit ahead of human needs. Now, to advance this fight, Abahlali, or the shareholders movement, have decided that what will ultimately help us is to organize poor and the working class people. There comes the power of organizing in a democratic country, in democratic spaces. But we need to build the power of the impoverished from below through popular educations and other forms of really building this power so as to change the power relations. Building solidarity between and within struggling communities becomes key. Building alliances and partnership within organized and progressive organizations is also important. We occupy vacant and unused land as a way to redress the imbalances that continue to create division and inequality between different nations. We resist, we develop our land. That's the way we as Abahlali can actually secure a place we call home. Now, to succeed, as the shareholders movement of South Africa, we have developed three strategies and tactics. The first one being the political strategy, meaning because these are impoverished communities, we got to rely on people's power. That's the power of organizing. When people come together in any democratic space, the reward is amazing. Now, when poor people come together, then the regressive forces and all those forces that keeps us in poverty become threatened. Hence, our first strategy is to actually the political one, which is the people's power, making sure that we organize people so that our voice can actually be heard. Now, the second strategy will be the use of media to expose, corrupt, and all forms of injustices that continue to exploit those who are marginalized in our communities, particularly the indigenous communities continue to be marginalized. Now, when we use the media, we know the power that comes with the exposure or exposing those who are corrupt, but also those who are keeping people in deep poverty, when we know that our world is rich enough to be able to feed, house, and look after every family at the global scale. The third strategy that we use is, of course, litigation. So we make sure that because lawyers are expensive, access to legal spaces is also very expensive for the poor and the working class. Hence, the litigation, the law, the courts are used as a last resort. So we do not just rely on law, because sometimes it is expensive also to have access to law, to lawyers and so on. Hence, for us, that becomes our last resort to be able to defend these rights, not only to defend and use the courts, the law as shield, but to use the courts, the law as weapons, also to make sure that we articulate the right to decent housing, but also to land that we have been denied for too long. So my appeal this afternoon, this morning, whatever time you are, it's very important that I say that the power of the impoverished, the working class, lies in the solidarity that they have amongst themselves. So organizing it would be very important for us to build allies across the globe, across color lines. So in this way, we are in a position to move from crisis to justice. It requires a lot of work indeed from amongst all of us. This is what we are called to do, and this is what I hope it is possible, as we have continuously calling upon member states that another world is necessary, and of course, another world is possible.
Thank you, Sabu. Very powerful.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. So, Jason, you've heard that another world is not only possible, but it's necessary. The importance of this, of the fight for human dignity. So how do we do this when we know that the capitalist logic is of perpetual expansion? We're breaching environmental limits and we have unsustainable consumption. Can we actually envisage an economy that provides this, a decent life, a good life for everybody within planetary boundaries?
Yeah, thanks very much, Asad, for the invitation to be here. And yeah, a very pertinent question. So yeah, the goal is clearly to try to build an economy that provides a good life for all, while at the same time remaining within planetary boundaries. And to get there, we need what you've basically described, a global Green New Deal that is just, feasible, and most importantly, anti-imperialist. So I want to spend the next couple of minutes just kind of describing some key principles to consider here. But first, let me start by just kind of reminding us where we stand with respect to the reality of ecological breakdown right now, while parsing out the colonial dimensions of this crisis. So first, in terms of climate breakdown, we all know that we have to cut global CO2 emissions in half by 2030 and get to zero by the middle of the century, which, by the way, existing pledges and policies get us nowhere near to achieving, even under the COP26 pledges. But there's also a few additional issues to keep in mind here. The first is crucial, and that's that zero by 2050 is a global average target, right? Rich countries have a responsibility to decarbonize much faster than this, given their disproportionate contributions to the problem. And we've described this empirically. The rich countries of the global north are responsible for a staggering 92% of all emissions in excess of the planetary boundary. In other words, the emissions that are presently causing climate breakdown, 92%, right? And the USA is single-handedly responsible for 40%. The entirety of the global south is responsible for only 8% of excess emissions. And that's from only a few countries. Most countries in the global south are still well within their fair share of the boundary. In other words, they've contributed nothing to climate breakdown. And yet the global south suffers the majority of the damage, including 80 to 90% of economic costs and 98 to 99% of climate-related deaths, right? So in many regions of the global south, climate breakdown is already an apocalypse. It'd be difficult to overstate the scale of this injustice, right? Rich countries have effectively colonized the atmospheric space for their own enrichment, with devastating consequences for the rest of the world and for all of life on Earth. In fact, rich countries have also already overshot their fair share of the budgets for 1.5 and 2 degrees. In other words, every additional ton of CO2 that they're presently emitting is in violation of climate justice principles. So we have to ask ourselves, in light of this, what should the decarbonization dates be for rich countries? The answer is as quickly as possible and no later than 2030, which we know to be a feasible date to achieve. So we have to stop talking about 2050 as a target for rich countries. It's immoral and it's unjust. We have to get beyond that. But crucially also, as Asad mentioned, climate is not the only crisis that we face. We're also overshooting several other planetary boundaries, including deforestation and land system change and biodiversity collapse. And these are being driven by excess resource use, right? So this is the other dimension of the issue. And by resource use, I mean all of the material stuff that we extract and produce and consume every year. And here too, there are clear colonial dimensions at play. And I want to emphasize this. rich nations are overwhelmingly responsible for excess resource use. They presently use in excess of about 4 times over their fair share of the planetary boundary. Meanwhile, lower income nations remain well within sustainable levels, right? But here's the other issue, is that the majority of the excess resource use in rich countries is net appropriated from poorer countries, right? So the global south basically siphons resources, the global north siphons resources from the global south to support its economic growth. Its growth depends on this resource appropriation. So this has 2 major implications to pay attention to. First, it means that southern resources are appropriated to service northern growthism and are therefore not available to meet local human needs, right? And this thus therefore perpetuates poverty in the global south. Second, it means that the ecological and social damages of growth in the global north are effectively externalized or offshored to the communities of the global south, which is where the violence happens, right? So northern states and corporations are effectively colonizing southern ecosystems. And I think the language of colonization is important here. It's clearly established in the text of the People's Agreements of Cochabamba, right? Which is sort of the guiding text of the climate justice movement. In the global north, people talk about the ecological crisis in terms of technology, whereas social movements in the global south are clear that it's a process of colonization, the colonization of atmosphere and ecosystems, and they call for decolonization in response, right? So a global Green New Deal needs to be commensurate to these realities. In terms of climate breakdown, the essential point is this. We need to stop talking about vague targets on emissions and get rid of net zero discourse. We need to be clear that rich nations need to actively scale down fossil fuel use on a binding annual schedule until the industry is more or less wound up, right? And we're looking at science-based targets and about 10% reduction in fossil fuel use per year. Until we have promises about capping and declining fossil fuel use in rich countries, the pledges on emissions reductions made by rich nations are basically hot air. They can't be trusted. So this is basically the point made by the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty campaign, which has been signed by several thousand scientists, including myself. This needs to be part of our discourse. On top of this, rich nations also need to reduce resource use by around 75% from existing levels, which is extraordinary. And that's necessary to reduce ecological breakdown, to reverse ecological breakdown, and to liberate the global south from the violence of northern extractivism, right? So this also needs to be part of our discourse. Now, here's the tricky bit. Ecological economists have pointed out that to make such a transition possible, rich nations will need to abandon growth as an objective and shift to a post-growth economy, okay? And this is true for 2 key reasons. The first is that pursuing growth makes a task of rapid decarbonization much more difficult to achieve. And the reason is because more growth means more energy demands, and more energy demands makes it more difficult to cover that demand with renewable capacity in the short time we have left, right? So rich nations need to be doing exactly the opposite, which is to actively scale down energy use. The principle here is that the less energy they use, the more quickly they can decarbonize their energy systems. And we must keep that in mind. Second, we know that more growth means more resource use, and that's a problem. And this is true in all existing resource models for the future. So on both fronts, it becomes clear that in order to achieve rapid decarbonization and to reverse ecological breakdown, rich countries need to abandon growthism and actively scale down energy and resource use. Okay, that needs to be core to any Green New Deal. And the good news is this can be done while at the same time improving human well-being. But to do that, we need to reorganize the economy around meeting human needs rather than around elite consumption and capital accumulation, which is the existing arrangements. So that's the task at hand we need to focus on. And this is actually quite straightforward. I mean, it may sound abstract, but it's very straightforward. Instead of assuming that every sector of the economy must grow all the time, regardless of whether or not we actually need it to, we should have a conversation about what things we actually want to improve, right? Things like more renewable energy, more public transportation, better public healthcare access, et cetera, and what sectors are clearly destructive and should be actively scaled down. So SUVs, private jets, fast fashion, industrial beef, advertising, the practice of planned obsolescence, the military-industrial complex. There are huge chunks of our economy that are not organized, that are organized around corporate profits rather than around human needs, right? Now, most people would regard this as sensible, except for one sticking point. What about jobs? Fortunately, there's a simple solution to this, which we've been calling for a long time, which is to shorten the working week, distribute necessary labor more evenly, thereby guaranteeing full employment, and introduce a climate job guarantee so that anyone who wants to can train to participate in the most important collective projects of our generation, everything from building renewable energy capacity to retrofitting buildings, to regenerating ecosystems and so on. This is about dignified, socially necessary work. So by doing this, we can de-link employment and livelihoods from economic growth. We also need to expand universal public services and dramatically reduce inequality to share income more fairly. So as I wrap up, let me just say that these social interventions are vital for two reasons. First, because once the question of livelihoods and well-being is off the table, then we can have an open conversation about real ecological policy, right? Without worrying about hurting people. So this takes care of the justice dimension. And second, because this is how you build a strong working class movement for a Green New Deal. It needs to be clear that ordinary people will not be hurt by this, and in fact will stand to gain significantly from such a transition that they can then fight for, right? So this approach, basically post-growth transition in the global north, is essential to liberating the South from the violence of atmospheric colonization and from resource appropriation, and is essential to enabling Southern governments to reclaim their own resources to meet human needs at a high standard. So this is an anti-colonial demand, right? And on top of that, we need what Asad mentioned, which is payments on in terms of reparations for climate and ecological debt, a guarantee of free technology transfers for renewable technologies like solar panels and wind turbines and batteries, so that all countries can have a rapid transition to renewables, and to ensure that all supply chains for renewable energy are socially just and ecologically safe. These are the core principles of an effective Green New Deal. And I look forward to hearing what the rest of my colleagues have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jason. And just also welcome Ilhan Omar. I will introduce her properly in a few minutes, but I'm so delighted that you're able to join us. I know it's very early in the United States at this moment. I want to just move to our next speaker, Jayati. I mean, you've just heard from Jason, the importance of abandoning growth, reorganizing our economy around meeting people's needs, some very key policies that we will need in terms of even basic things like the free transfer of technologies, which we've seen with the COVID vaccine has just not been possible. How do we, when we know we need to fix our trade system, our finance system, and tax, we need a fundamental overhaul of this whole architecture. Where do we begin, or where do you begin?
Well, thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be part of this discussion, and especially to follow after Jason, because I think many of the points that I would have liked to make have already been made. And so I can get on with talking about some of the further issues, I think, that follow on from this. I think Jason has highlighted how, global inequality is really underpinning the whole concern about the environment today and about climate change. And that this inequality is actually being further accentuated, of course, by the pandemic, but even with the negotiations on climate change and how we're dealing with climate change within our countries. The problem really is that too many Green New Deals are still national in scope. And in fact, I'm among friends here, so let me be frank. I think even among activists, too many ideas about greening are still very local, are still very personal and individual, and operating at that level, rather than recognizing the global structures that are not just creating more injustice, but are completely destroying the possibilities of actually addressing the existential challenge that we face in terms of climate change. So let me try and elaborate that a little bit. I think Jason already highlighted this about, the growth in the North being based fundamentally on extractivism. And one of the clear ways this comes out is not just in terms of per capita emissions. I mean, of course, that difference is stark, right? It's very, very stark, the difference in per capita emissions in the US and the European Union compared to most of the developing world. But also because those are based on production. Those are based on economic activity within those countries. And we know that the North is increasingly exporting its emissions. It's not just that it's doing that altogether, but it has changed its patterns of trade so that it has really exported all the highly emitting industries to the developing world. Massive changes in the US, in many European countries, in terms of relying more and more in consumption on the production of the South in the emitting industries, our activities. And of course, that's part of the broader issue. It's not just in terms of what you do it within your own country. You can be, zero carbon or whatever it is at some point in the future, in the distant future, in terms of your own production, but you could still be importing goods and services from the developing world, which require them to be more carbon emitting. And that is made worse by another point that Jason highlighted, which is the very determined attempt to prevent the transfer of technology. It's not just that their governments are not doing anything about it. They're actively supporting the monopoly of knowledge of the developed countries, of certain companies in the developed world, which are critical for mitigating climate change and adapting to climate change. And we've seen this, of course, with vaccines, but it is omnipresent in the whole climate alleviation world, where the control over essential knowledge is sought to be monopolized and is being actively abetted by the governments. I don't think enough people in the rich countries know this. I think if citizens knew this in the rich countries, they would actually object to it. But it's so bizarre that not only is the technology not getting transferred, but when some countries actively promote, let's say, renewable energy, China and India both subsidize solar and wind energy, they face cases in the WTO brought by the US, brought by other major powers, saying you are subsidizing something you shouldn't be, you're not allowed to subsidize this, that's against our WTO free trade principles. It's actually, they will not just prohibit the transfer of technology, but they will prevent other countries from trying to develop their own technologies by subsidizing these industries. So there is all of this going on, which is actually inhibiting the possibilities of genuine global cooperation for climate change. There's another aspect I want to point out, which again is something that is often overlooked. Many of the things that are associated with greening within the rich countries are actually adding to the exploitation of the South. So, for example, the whole shift towards electric vehicles, which is, of course, good, desirable. Yes, it's much better than your gas-consuming vehicles and so on, is based on mineral and rare earth extraction from the developing world, which is done in extremely damaging, environmentally damaging, people displacing, and cruel methods of extraction, whether it is lithium or it's rare earths or it's whatever you require for solar batteries and electric cars and so on. And yet people don't recognize, even the ones who are green enthusiasts in the North don't fully recognize that this is being done and that it's up to them to tell their companies not to use those extractivist methods in the developing world. Similarly, recycling. I'm currently teaching in Massachusetts in the US, and everybody's a recycler. Everyone's very proud of being a recycler. Of course, it's very good. But the US exports most of its waste. And that waste is then taken into countries in the developing world, including my own country, India, where it is recycled in the most obscenely terrible and dubious kinds of circumstances where it is dangerous, it is seriously damaging of the health of the workers, and done in very, very inhumane conditions. Again, this is not recognized. This is just, oh, well, we send it off and it gets recycled, so we don't have to worry about it anymore. There is a real issue, I believe, in terms of making people in the North aware of many of these features. You cannot just look at a particular thing in isolation. You have to look at its impact globally. And without that, none of this is going to change. Now, that's the bad news. Is there any good news? Is there any potential? Okay, let's also admit that the North has a credibility problem right now, okay? The whole vaccine fiasco, the whole climate finance fiasco, where, in Copenhagen, you promised $100 billion per year, and you've basically given an average of about 60 billion max, more than half of which is just loans by multilateral banks. So that's obviously, you cannot take the pledges of the developed world seriously because they're not going to deliver on it. While they will demand that you have to cut down on X and Y because, we are all in this together. So there's a credibility problem. How do we resolve this? How do we actually change it? Because we are facing an existential challenge. We are facing something that humanity is going to basically not be around if we don't do something urgently and really get together. We have to use our multilateral institutions in more democratic ways. The IMF can produce global liquidity. It's just created $650 billion worth of SDRs. Not much, nowhere near what we need. It could easily create a lot more. Who's holding it back? Governments of advanced countries. Do they need to hold it back? Well, there's no public demand for this in the North. It's not something that is even considered a big issue. But here is non-conditional liquidity that should be made immediately available. Instead of thinking about the old foreign aid paradigm and, countries giving money to these poor people in the destitute South and as charity, we have to move to a global public investment model. These are global challenges that require global responses. We need global public investment, where every country commits a certain part of its budget to these global demands. If you are going to spend, if you're going to have stimulus packages of 2 trillion, 3 trillion, you name it, trillion, allocate a proportion of that, maybe even 2%, 3%, allocate a proportion of that to global public investment, which is not aid, which is not conditional, which is not only given to your allies and strategic partners and so on, but is given to these global challenges which have to be dealt with. We need immediately to do something about these intellectual property rights. Once again, this is actually against the whole world. It is a few rich companies that are benefiting. Nobody else benefits from these patent regimes and these intellectual property rights that enable monopoly control over knowledge and monopoly rents. So we have to do something about that. Once again, there's not enough public demand for this in the developed world. Governments don't do things because they suddenly become good. They do it because people force them to. So these are the changes that we have to force on our governments, because otherwise you will not get international cooperation. You will not get a global response to what is ultimately something that is going to overtake all of us. So I think we somehow have to get this message across. Yes, it's good to be, all sort of green in your own life, or even in your own little community, or even in your own country, but it's not enough. And it's not going to solve the problem. You have to generate the global justice and the global equitable approach that will make everybody get on board. And for that, you have to have certain changes immediately in the policy stances of the North. Let me stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Jayati. Absolutely very, very powerful. And let me welcome Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. I know needs very little introduction to anybody. It has been really a shining light and a beacon of hope during some of the darkest years both within the United States and, of course, seeing the realities of these injustices. And Ilhan, you've been one of the most ardent proponents of a radical intersectional Green New Deal in the US that tackles both the climate inequality, uproots racial and gendered injustices. We've heard from Jason about the reality to deal with this moment of crisis, that we need to abandon growth and reorganize our economy to meet people's needs. We've heard from Jayati about the importance of finance and technology and fixing our rigged economy. And we had a comrade from South Africa talking about, from the reality of shack dollars on the ground, that the fight and the right to housing is a fight for control of land and the importance of building our political power. I'm just wondering, you've been a founder of the Global Parliamentary Alliance for a Global Green New Deal, how you see some of these key fights to make sure that the Global Green New Deal is both internationalist and global, and also how do we win on these?
Well, salam to you, Asad. And I know earlier you said it was early for us. I was a little sleepy, but Jayati's passionate speech right there woke me up. I am really excited to be with you all. Thank you so much for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be in community with all of you. As we fight to bring about transformative change on international climate response. For far too long, leaders have failed to take action needed to address the climate crisis with the urgency it deserves. Last week, we saw over 100,000 people out in the streets protesting in Glasgow, led by Indigenous youth who are in fear for their future. They have seen their leaders consistently side with special interests over their future. We cannot afford to ignore the cries of young people who will inherit a damaged climate from today's leaders. We don't have time for incrementalism. Climate change is here, and it is an existential threat to humanity. We've already seen the horrifying repercussions of failing to act. Wildfires raging across the West Coast, extreme hurricanes, heat waves in Australia, and massive flooding around the world. We've seen natural disasters displace large populations, rising sea levels leading to climate migration, and severe droughts impacting food supply. Natural disasters like these will only get worse unless we act as a global community to counteract this devastation and take bold and collective action to address this crisis. I am proud to work with global partners to advance the Green New Deal and bring about transformative change to our international climate response. As the US's founding member of the Global Alliance for a Green New Deal, I will provide some updates on what we've been working on in the US to address the climate crisis. In Congress, my top environmental priority is addressing climate change and helping our country reduce its carbon footprints by transitioning away from reliance on fossil fuels and moving towards 100% clean energy economy. As a co-sponsor of the Green New Deal, I am really excited to be able to lead the effort so that we don't leave our children the kind of future that's going to be devastated, so that they do actually have a fighting chance to inherit a planet that is habitable. And the saddest part is that the pain cost from this crisis is entirely self-inflicted. For decades, it's been US government policy to literally subsidize the very polluters who are fueling climate change, both at home and abroad. And that hasn't stopped. Right now, the US doles out more than $20 billion every year to subsidize fossil fuel energy when that money could be spent on putting people to work or investing in renewable energy. Large bipartisan majority of the United States public believe that fossil fuel corporations have a responsibility to address the dire consequences of their pollution. The largest fossil fuel producers must pay for their past greenhouse gas emissions, which could raise at least $500 billion alone. They must pay for the lives they have taken, for the futures they have robbed, and for the lasting toll their greed will have on the planet for generations to come. That's why I've introduced the End Polluters Welfare Act to eliminate domestic and international fossil fuel subsidies. I've also worked to make sure that repealing fossil fuel subsidies are listed as a priority for the Congressional Progressive Caucus, while we continue to work towards passing the president's Build Back Better agenda that includes a historical attempt to address the climate crisis. It includes the formation of a climate civilian corps that will create millions of jobs, help the United States transition to clean energy, and directly benefit communities on the front lines of climate crisis. It also makes the largest investment in clean energy than ever before. I'm excited for us to get this across the finish line. There is just too much at stake. And it is time for us to act both here in the United States and globally to reverse the worst effects of the climate catastrophe. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Ilhan, and so delighted, and of course, all power to your elbow. I know it's been a thankless task trying to ensure that the agenda within the United States is both ambitious, meeting the needs of people in the United States, but also truly internationalist, and that it isn't built on more the same logic of extraction and exploitation of the global South. And in fact, our next panelist, Lucio, speaks very directly to this, because there's lots of visions of this energy transition, particularly in the global North, that are going to be built or reliant on an unprecedented wave of new extraction that, of course, turns territories, ecosystems, and people's lives into sacrifice laws. I wonder, Lucio, if you could maybe talk about what is the energy transition that our movements from the South are envisaging, that how do we achieve a post-extractive energy transition that doesn't come at the expense of the global South? And this is, Lucio will speak in Spanish, so please do use the global icon for interpretation from Spanish to English. Lucio.
Muchas gracias, Asad. Un saludo fraterno a todas las personas que nos acompañan en esta sesión. Bueno, yo les quiero compartir una mirada desde Latinoamérica y desde Chile. Por un lado, cómo estamos viviendo la crisis, cuál es el momento que estamos viviendo frente a las políticas climáticas globales, y cómo también estamos viendo la construcción de estos acuerdos o estos pactos verdes. Quizás nos gustaría que fueran más multicolores y no solo verdes, para el futuro del planeta y de nuestras sociedades. Estamos viviendo un momento en que las nuevas políticas climáticas a nivel global están profundizando la crisis ambiental y política en Latinoamérica y particularmente en Chile, desde donde yo hoy día les hablo. Sin duda, estas políticas o este proyecto global de transición bajo en carbono está significando para nuestros países más extracción de materias primas y su apropiación, ¿no?, en función de estas políticas globales que están significando profundizar la mercantilización de lo que se denomina la mitigación y también las medidas de adaptación ante la crisis climática. ¿Esto qué significa? Significa más extractivismo minero, más cobre en el caso de Chile, más litio, en territorios que ya están profundamente degradados. Y hoy día, como parte de esa transición, que también se nos establece como una política interna en nuestros países, se impulsa la energía renovable. Pero una energía renovable que está en función de la exportación, no está en función de nuestra transición, está en función de esa transición de la política global, que hoy día se traduce, por ejemplo, en que la mayoría de nuestros países en Latinoamérica están formulando estrategias y políticas para el hidrógeno verde, que en el fondo es una forma de exportación de la energía renovable desde nuestros países a los países centrales. Y esto o para alimentar las industrias extractivas exportadoras de nuestros países. Esto está significando nuevos impactos, se profundizan los que ya conocíamos, nuevas formas de despojo, nuevas dependencias. Hoy día se amplían los ámbitos en que actúan los tratados de libre comercio, como el Tratado Transpacífico, como el Tratado de Libre Comercio entre la Unión Europea y Chile, o la Unión Europea y el Mercosur, o también la Carta Europea de Energía. Y vemos que en general no nos acercamos a tener las metas y los resultados que se dice perseguir a través de estas medidas. Entonces estamos en un escenario donde se ofrece falsas soluciones a la crisis y que en función están para generar más ganancias a partir de la crisis. Y allí, por ejemplo, aparecen lo que se denominan las falsas soluciones, como las políticas de carbono neutralidad, donde nuestros países también lo toman esto como un objetivo, como una meta a incorporar en las políticas internas. La electromovilidad, más litio, más cobre, sin cambiar nuestras formas de vida, sin cambiar los patrones de consumo, ¿no? Las soluciones basadas en la naturaleza, otra forma de mercantilizar la naturaleza y sus funciones. Parafraseando a David Harvey, que nos decía y nos habla de la acumulación por desposesión, hoy día nos enfrentamos a la descarbonización por desposesión. Nuestros territorios, nuestros países, ante estas políticas hoy día están sufriendo mayores impactos y mayores injusticias y desigualdades. Por lo tanto, el tema que se plantea en este evento es muy importante, ¿no? Cómo construir, cómo avanzar al nuevo Pacto Verde Global, que a nosotros nos llama a pensar en un acuerdo ecosocial, en un acuerdo intercultural que supere las lógicas hegemónicas y coloniales, y también en un acuerdo del punto de vista desde lo económico, pero desde los pueblos. Necesitamos que este nuevo pacto, estos nuevos acuerdos se basen en el reconocimiento de nuestros orígenes, de nuestras características socioculturales, de nuestros contextos geográficos, naturales, socioclimáticos. Necesitamos también que este debate, esta construcción que estamos haciendo del nuevo Pacto Verde Global, considere la existencia de las desigualdades para enfrentar los impactos que ya estamos viviendo de la crisis climática. Nosotros estamos habitando en una situación de profunda crisis por el neoliberalismo, por el extractivismo, pero también fragilizado, profundizado por la crisis climática global. Para nosotros la protección de la naturaleza no es un tema de retención o captura de carbono. La protección de la naturaleza es parte de nuestras concepciones de vida, de valoraciones distintas, ¿no? Por lo tanto, la relación comunidad-naturaleza es una cuestión esencial de cualquier proyecto de vida que podamos pensar para el futuro. Y por lo tanto, desde allí nosotros planteamos una transición post-extractivista y con justicia. Esto con un componente fuerte de solidaridad y de internacionalismo entre los pueblos por la vida digna de personas y de la naturaleza. Necesitamos poner en el horizonte el cambio de la forma en que estamos viviendo, pero también abandonar, como ya lo han mencionado los otros panelistas, el paradigma del crecimiento y del desarrollo. Para nosotros en Latinoamérica el horizonte es el buen vivir, es la soberanía alimentaria, es la soberanía energética. En el caso particular de Chile, que estamos en un proceso constituyente, es delinear, es dibujar un nuevo país plurinacional, feminista, que reconozca los derechos de la naturaleza, un país donde vamos a desprivatizar los derechos sociales, vamos a desprivatizar los bienes comunes naturales y los vamos a declarar bienes inapropiables. En ese camino estamos y desde allí queremos aportar a la construcción de este pacto, de este nuevo acuerdo que necesitamos desde los pueblos, como dijo Asad, construir desde abajo para una transición verdaderamente con justicia y post-extractivista. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Lucio. And what you talked about in terms of both the building up from the bottom, but the importance of challenging consumption from the top. And now in the global north, one of the sectors that people have been focusing on, of course, is the fashion industry, both as an accelerator of the climate crisis, but also for the fact that it's locked so many countries in the global south into a race to the bottom based on this exploitation of labor and extraction of resources. And we've always been struck that the response in the global north has been often amongst even very conscious people, won't buy anything. I won't buy fashion. And that, of course, ignores the realities of workers in those supply chains. And we saw over the last year, thousands and hundreds of thousands of garment workers thrown onto the scrappy factory gates locked, left destitute. Our partners there in Bangladesh and Kalpona have been working both in terms of dealing with that immediate impact. I wonder if you could speak to how the fight for climate justice in the fashion industry and challenging this overconsumption begins with this bottom up and a woman-led just transition for garment workers.
Sure, thank you, Asad, and thanks for having me here. And let me start with responding your one thing that consumer always think that I won't buy. And my response is always, not buying is not the solution. We need to find a solution, and that solution need to be sustainable, that need to be win-win for a consumer and a workers who is working bottom of the supply chain here in the production country. So, yeah, I mean, when people buy fashions, they might not realizing that how the fashion really, changing our ecological system in a negative way. Just to give in an idea that to make a basic white t-shirt, it needs 14 liters of water. Just for a basic t-shirt, just think about the million pieces of pair of jeans that we produce or the shirts. I mean, in that way, we already has been used the drinking water for our, I think next 200 years that people supposed to use that we already has been used. So that way it has been affected. So whenever the climate change or any other natural or human-made disaster happens, who pay the price? It is the first women and then children. So in our country, this is what we are facing. So the workers, those are making, producing the clothes for Western country. It is over 4 million workers are working, whom 60%, over 60% are young women worker. At some point, they are been, climate affected people. They have been affected in the countryside. Some of them maybe had a good life, but they had to transit themselves, but not in a sustainable industry. They ended up their life in a in a job where they are getting a poverty wages, which is not enough for their full month cost, let alone their children. And when we are making these cheap clothes, and people in the north, they're buying it and they do not wash it, maybe use 1 or 2 times, and then dump them. And they think that, oh, they need to do a charity. They need to do a, recycle to those clothes, and where they're sending to them, again, to our countries, because they think we don't have clothes. So we become another dumping area. This is not true. We do have clothes. You need to upcycle it, not recycle. Or you need to be a responsible consumer rather buying a cheap clothes. Why don't you change to buy a sustainable clothes? It is time. It is time. Buy less, but buy the clothes, because when you think that you are affecting climate, you feel guilty. No, it's not only your responsibility as a consumer. It is responsibility of all those brand retailers, the corporations, who making all of us fool in their profit greed and making all these cheap clothes, putting our lives in a long shifting hour with the low wages and selling these clothes to you and harming the climate. So what do we need to do? We need to ask these companies to make a sustainable clothes, but as a consumer, you need to make sure you pay a fair price to that, and you need to make sure that a good share of that coming to our workers who are making these clothes in the bottom of supply chain, in the production country, not in Bangladesh only, many other countries, next to me, like India, Myanmar, Jordan, or we can talk about Indonesia, we can talk about Cambodia, El Salvador, we can talk many other countries in the Latin America as well, who is producing that. So we need to make responsible. And how we are addressing this just transition, we are not only addressing the just transition alone due to the climate change, we are addressing the 4th industrial revolution in the same time as well, because the artificial intelligence also taking our jobs. So here we are educating our workers. In a country-wise, our government really doing a very minimum. Though, our government can be the leader because we are affected by this climate change. While many countries are being promising that they will be stopped producing coal energy, but our government is planting the coal energy, which going to be harm a mangrove forest, the biggest forest, which we call Sundarban, but the government totally overlooking that. So the government are not yet taken any, sustainable industries policies, which we are talking here. We started talking through the global union. So what we want, we definitely wanted to educate our women workers, and it has to be the women led because the women's are dense in this industry. We wanted to discuss these issues in every single place, from our factory, in our negotiating table, in the factory, in the community, in the region, in nationally, in globally. We want it to be every part of it. If we don't speak, the change will not come, because no one will be speaking on our behalf. So we are raising our voice in here, but alone we cannot make change. We need our consumers also to speak to us. We need a solidarity support from all the, who care about workers, who care about climate, who care about these people who are climate affected. We need to work together and bring these changes. So just transition is needed, but we want, it should become as positive as possible. In the bottom line, we want our jobs, but we want them with dignity. Thank you.
Absolutely, very, very powerful comment. Thank you so much. The slogan, nothing about us without us, is very true, particularly for workers in the global south, with hundreds of millions of jobs lost, millions of workers trapped in, of course, poverty wages, and the work that you do and many of our friends in labour unions are doing, talking about a justice transition that says, of course, we want good jobs, union jobs, but we want living wages, social protection, and universal public services. That consumers in the global north need to, yes, be ethical, but they need to be political, and we need to be holding our multinationals to account and looking at the structural inequalities and injustices. Ilhan fortunately had to leave because you can imagine she's very, very busy at the moment. I'm conscious of we've got a very few minutes. I'm going to we've had a couple of questions. One about what do people think about a universal basic income, and how do we turn this growing movement for climate justice into a movement for a global Green New Deal. I'll just, because we've only got about 5 minutes left, I'll give everybody 1 minute. If you wanted to answer this, I will go, either of these questions, I will just let you take it. So let me start with Sabu, in case, if you want to say anything. If not, I can move. You're muted, brother.
Yes, I just want to quickly say that I do support the universal income grant. I think it's important, especially that we are living in the most productive economy in human history, with resources enough, to be shared, to everyone. However, it cannot be sustainable unless there are mechanisms that government engage in a serious program of job creation so that everyone has a job. I don't think there's anyone who wants to live on handout, but because the state and corporates are doing deliberately not to create as much job as needed by our communities.
Thank you very much. Jason, if you have a 1 minute final, if you want to answer either of those.
Yeah, sure. No, I do support a universal basic income, and I think that it should be sort of brought in alongside of something like a climate job guarantee. So for people to be able to make a choice, basically, if they choose not to work or for whatever reason cannot work, they have a basic income to rely on. But a climate job guarantee becomes important for allowing us to mobilize labor around socially necessary use value production in terms of everything from regenerative agriculture to renewable energy capacity, et cetera. So I think that having these together is an important piece of a just transition.
Great. Lucio? Did you want to answer either of those or say anything final last minute?
Sí, no, desde el Pacto Ecosocial del Sur, uno de los puntos iniciales que se planteó con el lanzamiento de esta iniciativa en medio de la pandemia tiene que ver con alcanzar una renta básica universal, ¿no? Esto sin duda ha sido motivado y adquiere mucha fuerza con la profundización y la evidencia de las desigualdades que quedan expuestas con la pandemia. Creo que todavía no es un esfuerzo suficiente, pero ha abierto un horizonte de mayor justicia y dignidad para trabajadores, trabajadoras y para nuestros pueblos. Así que es una iniciativa que seguimos trabajando en esa línea.
Thank you very much. Kalpona, did you have anything to say about maybe the universal basic income?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I mean, that's all we can be with, but we need to remember that, you know, we don't want any empty promises. All the promises, whenever it is made, that never been worked. So we need, you know, any agreement that comes with, that has to be enforceable, which really needed. And of course, you know, who don't want, I mean, the universal basic income and protect human dignity is really important, we can be with. But again, when the brands and retailers comes with, you know, kind of, you know, thought that within 5 years or 10 years, gradually will be increased your living wage, that doesn't work. I mean, 10 years, we cannot wait to get that basic income. So we need to act now. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. And before we close, and thank you to all of our panel speakers, and of course, to our interpreters and to our BSL, Kira and Linda and Abel, and of course, the COP26 coalition. I just want to maybe end with saying, you know, of course, the fight about universal basic income or social protection, whatever words we use, there is a growing movement and a growing realization of all of these crises have got some common demands. And that's why as War on One, you know, not only have we been building and helping this COP26 coalition amplify this voice about climate justice, but to move towards a campaign based on movements and networks in the global south and a framework as well for a global Green New Deal. I would call on everybody, if you're not signed up, please sign up. The one lesson we know throughout history is that nothing changes until we collectively build our collective power. We organize and work together. So we really need you. We need you to be part and parcel of this. For those who are in Glasgow, tomorrow we carry on this conversation. We have in-person event with Sabrina Fernandez, who's from the Eco-Social Pact, Vijay Prashad, who's from the Tricontinental Institute, Nemo Bassi from the Mother Earth Foundation, Kay Aronoff, the author of How Capitalism Burned the Planet, and Richard Cosell-Wright from UNCTAD, to continue to do this. This, we know, is a major transformation of our climate justice movement into a movement that is actually putting forward a vision and a plan and building power towards it. This requires all of us. It can't be done by any of us alone, and we have to build the movement that's necessary. So thank you for absolutely everybody. This will be taking place tomorrow in Adelaide's Place at 11:45. It will also be live streamed, so those of you who are not in Glasgow will be able to watch and be part of this journey as well. We know that the Conference of Polluters may not deliver what we need, but we collectively are the conference of people, and we will deliver the transformation, and we will deliver the power and build the movement. So please do join. And again, thank you to everybody in the COP26 coalition for an amazing People Summit. And thank you to everybody who's watching, listening, whether you're on Facebook, on YouTube, or on this Zoom. We are the power. We're the people that this world has been waiting for. And only by working together collectively, building on the power of our movements in Abahlali, with the worker solidarity with OLCA and OCMAL, will we transform this world. Thank you ever so much.
Bye.